Picture this. You're watching The Lion King, and Scar lets Mufasa fall to his demise with that chilling line, "Long live the king." Your blood runs cold. This is pure evil incarnate. A brother so consumed by jealousy that he destroys everything good around him. For decades, we've accepted this narrative without question. Scar equals villain. Case closed. But what if everything we thought we knew about Disney's most iconic antagonist was fundamentally wrong? What if Scar wasn't actually evil at all, but rather the victim of something far more sinister? A biological attack that slowly destroyed his mind over years, turning a kind-hearted lion into the monster we came to fear. This isn't just wild speculation. When you dig deeper into Disney's expanded Lion King universe, particularly the Lion Guard series, a disturbing pattern emerges. The evidence suggests that Scar's transformation from hero to villain wasn't driven by character flaws or moral corruption, but by literal brain damage caused by untreated venom poisoning. The smoking gun lies in a flashback sequence that most viewers probably dismissed as throwaway backstory. But when examined through a medical lens, this scene reveals the exact moment when Taka, the lion who would become Scar, was deliberately infected with a neurotoxin that would slowly rob him of his ability to distinguish right from wrong. Let's start with what we know for certain. In the new Mufasa movie, we see young Taka as genuinely good-hearted. This isn't the scheming manipulator we expect. He saves Mufasa's life from crocodiles, not for personal gain, but because he desperately wants a brother. When forced to compete against Mufasa in a race where the loser faces elimination, Taka deliberately slows down to let Mufasa win. He sacrifices his own interests for someone else's well-being. This is the complete opposite of the Scar we know from the original film. So what changed? The Lion Guard provides the answer, though it's buried in what seems like a simple origin story. In a flashback sequence, Scar explains how he got his scar to Shari the snake. He describes being approached by a mysterious lion with similar scarring who proposed they take over the Pride Lands together. This should have been Taka's first red flag. The stranger's appearance clearly marked him as dangerous. But here's where it gets interesting. The strange lion doesn't try to convince Taka through argument or persuasion. Instead, he leads him directly into a trap. A cobra, positioned perfectly for an ambush, strikes Taka directly in the eye. The strange lion's plan wasn't to recruit Taka as an ally. It was to infect him with something that would slowly corrupt his mind. This wasn't random violence, it was biological warfare. Think about the precision involved. The cobra had to be in exactly the right position at exactly the right moment. The strange lion knew the snake was there. He orchestrated this entire encounter specifically to get Taka bitten. But why target the eye? Why not just have the snake bite his leg or shoulder? Because the eye provides direct access to the brain. When cobra venom enters through the eye, it bypasses many of the body's natural barriers and can reach neural tissue much more quickly than through other injection sites. The strange lion wasn't trying to eliminate Taka. He was trying to reprogram him, and it worked perfectly. Rafiki later explains in The Lion Guard that this particular type of snake bite, if left untreated, causes the victim to lose their ability to distinguish between right and wrong. This isn't metaphorical language, it's describing actual neurological damage. The venom literally rewires the brain's moral reasoning centers. But here's what makes this even more tragic. Taka tried to tell someone what happened. He rushed back to Pride Rock, probably hoping for medical attention or at least emotional support. Instead, Mufasa laughed at him and gave him the nickname Scar, turning his moment of vulnerability into a source of shame. Imagine being poisoned, knowing something is wrong with your thinking, and having your own brother mock your suffering. The psychological trauma of that rejection, combined with the ongoing neurological damage from untreated venom, created a perfect storm for Taka's eventual breakdown. The timeline fits perfectly. As leader of the Lion Guard, Scar would have been a respected protector of the Pride Lands. But gradually, as the venom continued affecting his brain, his decision-making became increasingly erratic. He began seeing threats everywhere, interpreting neutral actions as betrayals, and losing the ability to trust even his closest allies. Eventually, in a moment of venom-induced paranoia, he turned the roar of the elders against his own guard. The very lions he was supposed to protect. This wasn't a calculated power grab. It was a medical emergency that everyone mistook for moral failure. The loss of the roar wasn't punishment for evil intent. It was the natural consequence of using a sacred power while suffering from severe neurological impairment. But instead of recognizing this as a cry for help, everyone around Scar interpreted it as proof of his corruption. And so began the tragic spiral that would eventually lead to Mufasa's demise and the near destruction of the Pride Lands. But if this theory is correct, then Scar wasn't the architect of this tragedy. He was its first victim. The question that haunts this entire scenario is simple. What if someone had taken Taka's injury seriously? What if instead of mockery, he'd received proper medical treatment? What if the Pride Lands had recognized the signs of venom poisoning and acted to help rather than isolate? Would Mufasa still be alive? Would the Pride Lands have avoided years of devastation? Would countless lives have been spared? The evidence suggests that everything we've accepted about good versus evil in The Lion King might be built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually happened to one young lion who desperately needed help and instead received only rejection and ridicule. This isn't just about rewriting Disney history. It's about recognizing how quickly a medical crisis can be misinterpreted as moral failure, and how that misinterpretation can destroy not just the victim, but everyone around them. The real horror of Taka's situation becomes clear when you understand exactly what cobra venom does to the brain. This isn't Disney magic we're talking about. It's cold, hard biology, and the symptoms Scar displays throughout the films align perfectly with documented cases of untreated neurotoxic poisoning. Cobra venom contains powerful neurotoxins that specifically target the nervous system. When these toxins reach the brain, they don't just cause immediate damage, they create ongoing neurological dysfunction that can persist for years, even decades after the initial exposure. The victim experiences a gradual deterioration in cognitive function, particularly in areas related to impulse control, emotional regulation, and moral reasoning. In medical literature, patients with similar brain injuries often display what researchers call acquired sociopathy, a condition where someone who is previously empathetic and morally sound begins making increasingly harmful decisions without apparent remorse. The key word here is acquired. This isn't an inherent personality flaw, but brain damage that fundamentally alters how someone processes right and wrong. Rafiki's explanation in The Lion Guard isn't just mystical wisdom. It's an accurate description of neurotoxic effects. When he tells Kion that untreated snake venom makes you lose sight of what's right and wrong, he's describing the documented medical phenomenon where toxins damage the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for moral judgment and impulse control. But here's what makes Taka's case particularly tragic: the gradual nature of his decline. Cobra venom doesn't destroy the entire brain at once. Instead, it creates pockets of damage that slowly expand over time, like a poison spreading through neural pathways. This means Taka would have experienced periods of clarity mixed with increasing episodes of distorted thinking. Imagine the psychological torture of knowing something is wrong with your mind, but being unable to stop it. There would have been moments, maybe many moments, when the real Taka broke through the fog, horrified by what he was becoming but powerless to change course. The venom had already rewired his neural pathways, making rational decision-making nearly impossible. This gradual progression explains so much about Scar's behavior patterns. Why did he sometimes show flashes of his old self, particularly around family members? Because the venom damage wasn't complete. Parts of his original personality were still fighting to surface. Why did his plans become increasingly erratic and self-destructive? Because damaged neural pathways can't sustain complex long-term thinking. The physical scarring around his eye isn't just cosmetic. It's evidence of the injection site where the toxins entered his system. In real-world cases of venomous bites near the eye, the surrounding tissue often develops permanent discoloration and scarring as the body tries to contain and neutralize the toxins. What everyone interpreted as a mark of evil was actually a medical scar, visible proof of the biological attack that destroyed his mind. Consider how different characters react to Scar's scar throughout the franchise. They treat it as a symbol of his corruption, a physical manifestation of his evil nature. But they've got it backwards. The scar isn't marking his evil, it's marking his victimization. Every time someone sees that scar and assumes the worst about Scar's character, they're aiding to the isolation and rejection that pushed his damaged mind further toward destructive behavior. The timeline of Taka's deterioration also supports the Venom theory. According to the Lion Guard, he was a respected leader when he first received the Roar of the Elders. The great kings of the past don't grant such power to lions with corrupt hearts. They must have seen genuine good in him. But gradually, as the venom continued affecting his brain, his leadership became more aggressive, more paranoid, more disconnected from the well-being of others. His destruction of his own lion guard wasn't a calculated betrayal. It was a psychotic break triggered by venom-induced paranoia. In his damaged mind, he probably genuinely believed his own team was plotting against him. The neurotoxins would have made it impossible for him to accurately assess threat levels or distinguish between real and imagined dangers. When the roar abandoned him after this incident, it wasn't because he had chosen evil. It was because his brain could no longer safely channel such powerful forces. The great kings of the past weren't punishing him for moral failure. They were protecting everyone from what his damaged mind might do with that kind of power. But nobody recognized this as a medical emergency. Instead of getting Taka the treatment he desperately needed, everyone around him interpreted his symptoms as character defects. The isolation and rejection that followed only accelerated his psychological decline, as his damaged brain struggled to process the social consequences of his neurological impairment. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Cobra venom can and does cause exactly the type of behavioral changes we see in Scar. The gradual loss of empathy, the increasing paranoia, the inability to form healthy relationships, the destructive decision-making, these aren't signs of inherent evil. They're textbook symptoms of untreated neurotoxic poisoning. What's particularly haunting is how preventable this entire tragedy was. If Taka had received proper medical attention immediately after the bite, the venom could have been neutralized before causing permanent damage. Ancient remedies for snake bites existed. Rafiki himself demonstrates extensive knowledge of antidotes and healing techniques throughout the franchise. But instead of treatment, Taka received mockery. Instead of support, he got a nickname that turned his trauma into a source of shame. Instead of medical intervention, he faced social isolation. Every missed opportunity for healing pushed his damaged mind further down a path it was never supposed to travel. The mark of evil that everyone feared wasn't marking evil at all. It was marking a medical victim who never received the help he needed. And that misunderstanding would eventually cost the Pride Lands everything. The most compelling evidence for the venom theory lies in the stark contrast between who Taka was before the snakebite and who he became afterward. When you examine these two versions of the same lion side by side, you're not looking at character development or moral decline. You're witnessing the documented progression of neurological damage in real time. Let's start with pre-bite Taka from the Mufasa movie. This isn't the calculating manipulator we've been conditioned to expect. Instead, we see a lion whose primary motivation is connection and family. When he first encounters lost young Mufasa, about to be devoured by crocodiles, Taka doesn't hesitate. He doesn't calculate the risks or consider what's in it for him. He simply acts to save a life because it's the right thing to do. But it goes deeper than just heroic instincts. Taka's desire for a brother is so genuine, so pure, that he's willing to sacrifice his own future for it. Think about what this means from his perspective. He's the heir to his father's pride, destined to be king. Finding Mufasa should represent a threat to that inheritance. Any rational, self-interested lion would see Mufasa as competition to be eliminated. Instead, Taka sees an opportunity for the family connection he's always craved. When his father Obasi sets up the race, winner stays, loser gets cast out, Taka faces an impossible choice. He can secure his birthright by winning, or he can gain the brother he's always wanted by losing. The decision he makes reveals everything about his character. As the race reaches its climax, with Taka clearly in the lead, he deliberately slows down. He whispers to Mufasa about his dream of having a brother, then ensures Mufasa wins. This isn't just kindness, it's self-sacrifice of the highest order. Taka literally gives up his throne, his inheritance, his entire future, because having a brother means more to him than having power. This is the lion who would later let Mufasa fall to his demise? The psychological profile doesn't match. You don't go from that level of selfless love to fratricidal rage through normal character development. Something fundamental had to change in Taka's brain structure to make such a transformation possible. Even after giving up his throne, Taka continues putting Mufasa's well-being above his own. When they're forced to flee from Kiros and the outsiders, Taka doesn't resent his displaced status. He doesn't blame Mufasa for the loss of his birthright. Instead, he focuses on their shared journey, their growing bond as brothers, their mutual dreams of finding Maleli. When they meet Sarabai, we see another crucial aspect of pre-bite Taka's personality, his capacity for healthy romantic feelings. Yes, he's attracted to Sarabai, but watch his behavior carefully. He doesn't try to dominate or manipulate her. He doesn't scheme against Mufasa when it becomes clear she prefers his brother. His heartbreak is genuine and understandable, but it doesn't drive him to violence or revenge, and at least not initially. The first crack in Taka's moral foundation comes when jealousy over Sarabi leads him to betray their location to Kiros. But even this betrayal fits the pattern of someone whose judgment is becoming impaired. The decision is impulsive, emotional, driven by pain rather than calculated malice. And crucially, when he sees Kiros about to end Mufasa's life, Taka immediately regrets his choice and intervenes, taking the wound that becomes his scar. This moment, jumping between Kiros and Mufasa, absorbing a potentially fatal attack to save his brother, this is still the real Taka. Even after his betrayal, even consumed by jealousy and hurt, his fundamental love for Mufasa overcomes everything else. He's willing to sacrifice his own life to undo his mistake. But then comes the snakebite from the Lion Guard flashback, and everything changes. Post-bite Taka, now Scar, displays a completely different psychological profile. Where the original Taka was driven by love and connection, Scar becomes increasingly isolated and paranoid. Where Taka made impulsive decisions based on emotion, Scar begins plotting elaborate schemes with cold calculation. Where Taka's mistakes came from pain and could be corrected, Scar's actions become increasingly irreversible and destructive. The change isn't immediate. That's what makes it so insidious. Neurotoxins don't flip a switch from good to evil overnight. Instead, they gradually erode specific brain functions while leaving others intact. Early post-bite Scar probably still had moments of clarity, still felt echoes of his former self. But as the venom damage spread through his neural pathways, these moments became rarer and weaker. As leader of the Lion Guard, Scar initially tries to use his position responsibly. He's given the Roar of the Elders, a power that requires moral purity to obtain. But the venom is already working, creating small distortions in his thinking, tiny moments of poor judgment that gradually compound into larger problems. The Strange Lion's plan was diabolically clever. By targeting the Lion Guard leader, he wasn't just corrupting one individual. He was positioning a compromised lion to eventually have access to the throne. Every day that Scar remained in his leadership position, while mentally deteriorating, was another step toward the Pride Land's eventual downfall. When Scar finally destroys his own Lion Guard with the Roar, it represents the complete triumph of venom damage over his original personality. The lion who once sacrificed his throne for a brother has become someone who would eliminate his own allies based on paranoid delusions. This isn't character growth, it's neurological catastrophe. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this transformation is how everyone around Scar interprets it. They see his increasingly erratic behavior and assume it reflects his true nature finally being revealed. They don't recognize the medical emergency unfolding before their eyes. They don't see a lion losing his mind. They see a lion choosing evil. Mufasa's reaction when Taka tells him about the snakebite incident is particularly tragic. Instead of concern for his brother's well-being, instead of investigating what might have happened, Mufasa laughs and gives him the nickname Scar. He turns Taka's moment of vulnerability into a source of shame, his cry for help into a punchline. This reaction would have been devastating for someone with normal brain function. For someone suffering from venom-induced neurological damage, it was catastrophic. The rejection and ridicule from the person he loved most would have accelerated the psychological spiral, pushing his damaged mind further toward isolation and resentment. From that moment forward, every interaction between the brothers is filtered through Scar's increasingly distorted perception. His damaged brain interprets Mufasa's success as personal attacks, normal royal duties as deliberate slights, everyday interactions as evidence of a conspiracy against him. The lion who once gave up everything for his brother's happiness becomes convinced that same brother is actively working to destroy him. The mind that once made sacrifices based on love begins making increasingly destructive decisions based on fear and paranoia. By the time we reach the original Lion King, the transformation is complete. The Taka who saved Mufasa from crocodiles, who gave up his throne, who took a mortal wound to protect his brother, that lion is gone. buried under layers of neurotoxic damage that have rewired his entire personality. When Scar lets Mufasa fall in the gorge, we're not witnessing the triumph of evil over good. We're watching the final, tragic victory of untreated medical trauma over a mind that was never supposed to think such thoughts or make such choices. The real Taka died the day that Cobra's fangs found their mark. What lived on in Scar's body was something else entirely. A damaged echo of greatness, slowly poisoned into becoming everything the original lion would have died to prevent. The progression from Lion Guard leader to fratricidal tyrant wasn't a moral choice. It was a medical inevitability. Once Cobra Venom begins systematically damaging the neural pathways responsible for judgment, empathy, and impulse control, the victim enters a psychological spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. What makes Scar's case particularly tragic is how his deteriorating mind tried desperately to maintain control, even as the neurological damage made rational leadership impossible. Understanding Scar's destruction of his own Lion Guard requires recognizing the specific ways neurotoxins affect perception and decision-making. Patients with similar brain injuries often develop what psychologists call paranoid ideation, the tendency to interpret neutral or even supportive actions as threats. The damaged brain struggles to accurately assess social situations, leading to increasingly distorted conclusions about others' intentions. For Scar, this would have manifested as growing suspicion toward the very lions he was supposed to trust most. His guard members, probably loyal friends who had served alongside him for years, would have begun appearing threatening in his compromised perception. Their normal questions about his decisions would sound like challenges to his authority. Their concerned observations about his changing behavior would register as plots against him. The venom damage wouldn't have happened all at once. Instead, Scar would have experienced good days and bad days, moments of clarity mixed with periods of increasing paranoia. On his better days, he probably recognized that something was wrong with his thinking, but the damaged neural pathways made it impossible for him to maintain consistent rational judgment, and the bad days gradually began outnumbering the good ones. When he finally turned the roar of the elders against his own guard, it wasn't a calculated power grab. It was a psychotic break. In his poisoned mind, he genuinely believed these lions were plotting to overthrow him, possibly even to harm him physically. The neurological damage had made it impossible for him to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones, between loyal friends and dangerous enemies. The tragic irony is that his guard probably was growing concerned about his behavior, but out of love and loyalty, not treachery. They likely noticed his increasing paranoia, his erratic decision-making, his growing isolation from the pride he was supposed to protect. Their plotting might have consisted of worried conversations about how to help their compromised leader, discussions about whether to seek guidance from Mufasa or medical attention from Rafiki. But Scar's damaged brain interpreted these expressions of concern as confirmation of his worst fears. The venom had rewired his neural pathways to see betrayal everywhere, making it impossible for him to recognize that his friends were trying to save him, not destroy him. The loss of the roar following this incident represents one of the most misunderstood aspects of Scar's story. Everyone assumes he lost this sacred power because he chose evil over good, because he used it for selfish purposes. But the real explanation is far more heartbreaking. The great kings of the past didn't take the roar away as punishment. They removed it as a safety measure. Think about what the roar of the elders actually represents. A connection to the wisdom and judgment of previous kings, channeled through a living vessel. For this power to work safely, the vessel needs to maintain clear moral reasoning and sound judgment. When Scar's brain became compromised by neurotoxic damage, he could no longer safely channel such forces. The great kings of the past weren't punishing Scar for moral failure. They were protecting everyone from what his deteriorating mind might do with unlimited power. It was a medical quarantine, not a moral judgment. But because nobody understood the true nature of Scar's condition, everyone interpreted the loss of the roar as proof of his corruption rather than evidence of his illness. This misunderstanding deepened Scar's isolation at exactly the moment when he needed support most. Losing the roar didn't just strip him of power, it confirmed in everyone's eyes that he had chosen darkness over light. The respect and authority he had built as Lion Guard leader evaporated overnight, replaced by suspicion and rejection from the very community he had dedicated his life to protecting. For someone suffering from venom-induced paranoia, this social rejection would have been catastrophic. The damaged neural pathways that were already making him see threats everywhere now had real evidence to work with. The Pridelands really were turning against him, really were stripping away his status and authority, really were treating him as dangerous and untrustworthy. Of course, they were doing this because his behavior had become genuinely concerning, not because of any conspiracy against him. But Scar's compromised brain couldn't make that distinction. All he could process was that his worst fears were coming true. Everyone really was against him. This is when he began reaching out to the hyenas, and this alliance reveals another tragic aspect of his neurological decline. In his healthy state, Taka would never have associated with the Prideland's traditional enemies. His moral compass and strategic thinking would have prevented such a destructive choice. But the venom damage had compromised both his ethical reasoning and his ability to anticipate long-term consequences. The hyenas represented the only group willing to accept him after his fall from grace. For someone whose damaged brain was desperately seeking allies and validation, they offered exactly what he needed: unconditional support and recognition of his authority. They didn't care about his medical condition or his recent failures. They just wanted access to the Prideland's resources. What Scar probably saw as brilliant strategic alliance building was actually the desperate decision-making of a compromised mind seeking any form of social connection. The neurotoxins had damaged his ability to form healthy relationships with lions who might have genuinely helped him, leaving him vulnerable to manipulation by those who would exploit his condition for their own benefit. His eventual rise to power following Mufasa's demise represents the ultimate tragic irony. A lion whose brain had been systematically destroyed by poison, attempting to rule a kingdom that required precisely the mental faculties he no longer possessed. The Pridelands needed wise leadership, careful resource management, and diplomatic balance. Scar's damaged mind could provide none of these things. Every decision he made as king reflects the specific types of impairment caused by neurotoxic damage. His inability to maintain the delicate ecological balance that kept the Pridelands thriving wasn't laziness or evil. It was the result of damaged neural pathways that could no longer process complex, interconnected systems. His increasingly erratic behavior toward the lionesses wasn't deliberate cruelty. It was the manifestation of brain injury that had compromised his capacity for empathy and social reasoning. The drought and famine that devastated the Pridelands during his reign weren't divine punishment for moral failings. They were the predictable result of putting someone with severe neurological impairment in charge of managing a complex ecosystem. Scar's damaged brain simply couldn't handle the multifaceted decision-making that successful leadership required. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of his reign is how desperately he seemed to be fighting against his own limitations. There are moments throughout the original film where flashes of his old self appear to break through the fog of neurological damage. When he's alone, sometimes his expression suggests awareness that something is terribly wrong, that the kingdom is falling apart around him, that he's become something he never intended to be. But the venom damage made it impossible for him to translate that awareness into effective action. His compromised brain couldn't maintain the sustained, rational thinking necessary to reverse the Prideland's decline. Every attempt to fix problems created new problems. Every decision seemed to make things worse. Every day brought fresh evidence that he was failing at the most basic requirements of leadership. By his final confrontation with Simba, the neurological deterioration had reached its end stage. When he tries to blame the hyenas for everything that went wrong, he's not just being cowardly. He's displaying the confused, fragmented thinking characteristic of severe brain damage. His inability to take responsibility isn't moral weakness. It's cognitive impairment that has destroyed his capacity for accurate self-assessment. The question that haunts his final moments is whether any trace of the real Taka remained buried beneath the layers of neurotoxic damage. When the hyenas close in on him at the end, does some part of his original personality break through the fog to understand what he's become? Does he remember, even briefly, the lion who once sacrificed everything for his brother's happiness? We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is that the lion who perished in those flames wasn't the same one who saved young Mufasa from crocodiles, who gave up his throne for love, who took a mortal wound to protect his brother. That lion had been lost years earlier, the day a cobra's fangs delivered their toxic payload and began the slow, inexorable process of destroying one of the Prideland's greatest potential kings. The real tragedy isn't that Scar chose evil over good, it's that he never had a choice at all. The implications of the Venom theory extend far beyond rewriting one character's story. They fundamentally challenge how we understand justice, responsibility, and moral judgment throughout the entire Lion King saga. If Scar was indeed a victim of biological warfare rather than a willing villain, then every character who failed to recognize his medical crisis shares responsibility for the tragedy that followed. This realization forces us to examine the Pride Land's social and medical systems with uncomfortable scrutiny. Here was a kingdom with access to advanced healing knowledge through a Rafiki, mystical wisdom from the great kings of the past, and supposedly enlightened leadership under Mufasa. Yet somehow, none of these resources were mobilized to help a clearly suffering individual whose condition was entirely treatable if caught early. Rafiki's role in this tragedy is particularly complex. As the Pride Land's primary healer and spiritual advisor, he possessed both the medical knowledge to treat snake bites and the mystical connection to diagnose spiritual ailments. When Taka came to him with the cobra bite, Rafiki should have immediately recognized the neurological danger and begun aggressive treatment to neutralize the venom before permanent damage occurred. Instead, like everyone else, Rafiki seems to have dismissed Taka's condition as a minor injury rather than the medical emergency it actually was. This represents a catastrophic failure of the very systems designed to protect the Pride Land's inhabitants from exactly this type of threat. The healer who later proves capable of treating similar conditions in the Lion Guard somehow missed the most critical case of his career. But Rafiki's failure goes deeper than missed diagnosis. Throughout Scar's deterioration, as his behavior became increasingly erratic and destructive, Rafiki never appears to have considered medical causes for the psychological changes. The mystical advisor who can commune with spirits and interpret complex magical phenomena somehow couldn't recognize the obvious symptoms of neurotoxic poisoning in someone he had known for years. This blindness to medical explanations for behavioral changes reflects a deeper problem in how the Pride Land society approached mental health and neurological conditions. Like many cultures, they appeared to interpret psychological symptoms as moral failings rather than medical issues requiring treatment. When someone's behavior changed dramatically, the assumption was character corruption rather than brain injury. Mufasa's reaction to his brother's condition exemplifies this systemic failure. As king, he had both the resources and responsibility to investigate why his brother, previously a loyal Lion Guard leader, was displaying increasingly concerning behavior. Instead of ordering medical evaluation or seeking expert consultation, Mufasa seemed content to write off Scar's changes as personal choices, deserving of social rejection. The nickname incident becomes even more tragic when viewed through this lens. When Taka tried to explain the snake bite that would eventually destroy his mind, Mufasa's response was mockery rather than concern. This wasn't just insensitive, and it was medically negligent. A responsible leader would have immediately consulted with healers, investigated the circumstances of the attack, and ensured proper treatment for potential complications. Instead, Mufasa's ridicule effectively silenced any further attempts by Taka to seek help or explain his condition. The psychological damage of being dismissed and mocked by the person whose opinion mattered most would have accelerated Taka's social isolation, making it even less likely that he would receive the medical attention he desperately needed. This pattern of medical neglect raises disturbing questions about the Pride Land's approach to healthcare and social responsibility. If someone as prominent as the Lion Guard leader could suffer such obvious neurological decline without intervention, how many other individuals were failing to receive proper care for treatable conditions? How many other tragedies were brewing because medical symptoms were being interpreted as moral failures? The strange lion's role in orchestrating Taka's poisoning suggests something even more sinister. This may have been biological warfare specifically designed to destabilize the Pride Lands from within. By targeting the Lion Guard leader with a slow-acting neurotoxin, the attacker created a sleeper agent who would gradually compromise the kingdom's security over years or decades. Think about the strategic brilliance of this approach. Rather than launching a direct military assault that might fail, the strange lion essentially programmed Taka to eventually destroy the Pride Lands from a position of trusted authority. Every day that passed without treatment was another step toward the kingdom's eventual downfall, orchestrated by someone whose loyalty and judgment were slowly being eroded by toxic brain damage. This raises the possibility that similar attacks might have been launched against other kingdoms, other potential leaders, other individuals in positions of power or influence. The strange lion's scarring suggests he himself might have been a victim of such tactics, creating a cycle of neurologically compromised individuals spreading their condition through deliberate infection. If this interpretation is correct, then Scar's story becomes part of a much larger pattern of biological warfare designed to topple stable kingdoms through systematic brain damage of key leadership figures. The Pride Lands weren't just dealing with one corrupted individual. They were facing the effects of a coordinated attack on their most fundamental institutions. The modern parallels to this scenario are both obvious and disturbing. How often do we criminalize the symptoms of mental illness rather than treating the underlying medical conditions? How frequently do we interpret behavioral changes as moral failures rather than neurological problems requiring intervention? How many tragedies could be prevented if we approach psychological crises with medical compassion rather than social judgment? Scar's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own society's treatment of individuals, whose behavior becomes destructive due to factors beyond their control. When someone with untreated mental illness commits harmful acts, do we focus on punishment or treatment? Do we ask why the medical intervention failed, or do we simply assume personal responsibility for actions that may have been neurologically inevitable? The Venom theory also raises profound questions about moral accountability during periods of compromised mental capacity. If Scar's actions were the direct result of brain damage that destroyed his ability to distinguish right from wrong, can he be held responsible for the choices made by his poisoned mind? Where do we draw the line between medical victim and moral agent? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They have direct implications for how we structure justice systems, healthcare policies, and social support networks. If we accept that neurological damage can fundamentally alter personality and decision-making capacity, then we must also accept that some harmful behaviors require medical intervention rather than punitive response. Disney's decision to embed this theory across multiple properties. The Lion Guard's explicit explanation of venom effects, Mufasa's portrayal of innocent Taka, the original film's hints at medical scarring, suggest they may have intentionally planted these clues for audiences willing to dig deeper. Perhaps they wanted to create a more nuanced understanding of how good individuals can become destructive forces through circumstances beyond their control. Or perhaps they were commenting on real-world situations where society fails to recognize and treat medical conditions that manifest as behavioral problems. The Pride Land's inability to help Taka mirrors our own struggles to address mental health crises before they escalate into larger tragedies. The ultimate question raised by the Venom theory isn't whether Scar was evil or innocent. It's whether any of us can truly judge someone whose mind has been chemically rewired against their will. If the capacity for moral reasoning can be destroyed by biological factors, then perhaps our entire framework for understanding good and evil needs fundamental revision. When we see someone whose behavior has become destructive, our first instinct should be to ask, what happened to change them? What medical, psychological, or neurological factors might be involved? What treatment options exist, and why haven't they been implemented? Instead of asking whether someone deserves punishment for their actions, perhaps we should be asking whether they received proper medical care for the conditions that drove those actions in the first place. If Scar was just a victim of untreated poisoning who never received the help he needed, what does that say about how we judge others who've lost their way? And more importantly, what responsibility do we have to ensure that the next Taka doesn't suffer the same preventable fate? The real tragedy of Scar's story isn't that evil triumphed over good. It's that a completely preventable medical crisis was allowed to destroy not just one life, but an entire kingdom, because nobody recognized the difference between symptoms and choices. Perhaps it's time we learn to tell that difference ourselves. The most haunting aspect of reconsidering Scar's story through the lens of medical tragedy is how it transforms our understanding of every other character's moral standing. If we accept that Taka was a victim rather than a villain, then everyone who failed to help him becomes complicit in the devastation that followed. This isn't just about rewriting one lion's legacy. It's about confronting the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the greatest evils arise not from malicious intent, but from collective indifference to suffering we don't recognize or understand. Consider the ripple effects of this realization across the entire Pride Lands community. The lionesses who whispered about Scar's strangeness instead of expressing concern for his obvious distress. The advisors who focused on political maneuvering rather than investigating why their former Lion Guard leader was displaying such erratic behavior. The healers who treated surface wounds while ignoring clear signs of neurological damage. Each missed opportunity for intervention represents not just individual failure, but systemic breakdown. The Pride Lands had established institutions specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of tragedy, spiritual guidance, medical expertise, royal oversight, community support networks. Yet all of these safeguards failed simultaneously when confronted with a crisis that required them to look beyond surface appearances and conventional assumptions. This pattern of institutional failure becomes even more disturbing when we consider how it enabled the strange lion's biological warfare strategy to succeed so completely. The attacker didn't just rely on the cobra's venom to destroy Taka's mind. He counted on the Pride Land's social systems to compound that damage through neglect and rejection. The poisoning was only the first phase of a multi-layered assault designed to exploit the kingdom's blind spots regarding mental health and medical intervention. The strange lion understood something that the Pride Land's leadership apparently didn't: that neurological damage combined with social isolation creates a devastating feedback loop. Each rejection pushes the victim further into paranoid thinking, while each paranoid action justifies further rejection, until the original person disappears entirely beneath layers of accumulated psychological trauma and chemical brain damage. By targeting Taka specifically, a lion known for his desperate desire for connection and family, the attacker maximized the emotional impact of inevitable social ostracism. Someone whose core identity revolved around relationships would be particularly vulnerable to the isolation that neurological symptoms would inevitably create. The strange lion wasn't just destroying Taka's brain, he was systematically dismantling everything that made Taka who he was. This calculated cruelty reveals the true scope of the conspiracy against the Pride Lands. We're not dealing with random violence or opportunistic chaos, but with sophisticated psychological warfare designed to exploit specific cultural blind spots and individual vulnerabilities. The strange lion had studied his target, understood the social dynamics he could manipulate, and crafted an attack that would turn the Pride Land's own values and institutions against themselves. The success of this strategy raises deeply troubling questions about how many other kingdoms might have fallen to similar tactics. How many other evil rulers throughout history might have been victims of biological warfare that their societies lacked the medical knowledge or social framework to recognize and treat? How many tragedies attributed to moral failure might actually represent medical emergencies that spiraled out of control due to systemic neglect? These questions become particularly relevant when we examine the broader Lion King universe and notice patterns of behavioral change that might indicate similar attacks. Characters who display sudden personality shifts, unexplained aggression, or deteriorating judgment might not be choosing evil. They might be suffering from conditions that their communities don't know how to diagnose or treat. The implications extend beyond individual cases to challenge our fundamental assumptions about the nature of heroism and villainy. If Scar was a victim rather than a perpetrator, then perhaps true heroism lies not in defeating those who've been corrupted, but in preventing that corruption from taking hold in the first place. The real heroes of this story should have been the healers who recognized neurological symptoms, the leaders who ordered medical intervention, the friends who refused to abandon someone whose behavior was becoming concerning. Instead, the actual heroes of the Lion King saga are those who responded to the crisis after it had already destroyed multiple lives and devastated an entire kingdom. Simba's eventual triumph represents damage control rather than prevention, reactive justice rather than proactive compassion. While his actions restored order to the Pride Lands, they did nothing to address the systemic failures that allowed the tragedy to unfold in the first place. This distinction between reactive and preventive heroism has profound implications for how we approach similar crises in our own world. When we celebrate those who defeat dangerous individuals, are we focusing on the right kind of heroism? Should we instead be celebrating those who identify and treat the conditions that create dangerous individuals before they can cause harm? The medical community has long recognized that preventing disease is more effective than treating its symptoms after they've caused irreversible damage. Mental health professionals understand that early intervention can prevent psychological crises from escalating into destructive behavior. Social workers know that addressing root causes of dysfunction is more sustainable than managing their consequences. Yet, our cultural narratives continue to emphasize reactive heroism over preventive care. We celebrate the warrior who defeats the monster, not the healer who prevents the monster from being created. We honor those who restore order after chaos, not those who maintain stability before disruption occurs. We remember the dramatic confrontation, not the quiet intervention that made confrontation unnecessary. Scar's story challenges us to reconsider these priorities. If his transformation from hero to villain represents a preventable medical tragedy, rather than an inevitable moral failing, then perhaps we should be asking different questions about the individuals in our own society whose behavior becomes destructive over time. Instead of focusing solely on punishment and containment after someone becomes dangerous, what if we invested equal energy in identifying and treating the neurological, psychological, and social conditions that push people toward destructive choices? Instead of waiting for the dramatic confrontation between good and evil, what if we address the medical emergencies that create evil in the first place? The strange lion's biological warfare succeeded because it exploited a fundamental weakness in how societies understand and respond to mental health crises. Until we develop better systems for recognizing and treating neurological conditions that affect behavior, we remain vulnerable to similar attacks, whether intentional like the cobra bite, or accidental like untreated head injuries, toxin exposure, or degenerative brain diseases. The Venom theory forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some of the individuals we've labeled as evil might actually be medical victims whose conditions we failed to recognize or treat. Some of the tragedies we've attributed to moral failure might represent preventable neurological crises that escalated due to systemic neglect. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior or eliminate the need for public safety measures, but it does suggest that our approach to destructive individuals should include medical evaluation alongside legal consequences, treatment options alongside punishment, compassion alongside justice. If we're serious about preventing future tragedies like the one that befell the Pride Lands, we need to become better at recognizing the early signs of neurological compromise before they progress to dangerous levels. We need healthcare systems that can identify and treat conditions like venom poisoning before they cause permanent brain damage. We need social support networks that respond to behavioral changes with concern rather than rejection. Most importantly, we need to develop the wisdom to distinguish between someone who chooses evil and someone whose capacity for choice has been chemically or neurologically compromised. That distinction could mean the difference between perpetuating cycles of tragedy and breaking them before they can cause irreparable harm. The real lesson of Scar's story isn't that evil can triumph over good or that good can ultimately defeat evil. It's that the categories of good and evil themselves might be less clear-cut than we've assumed. Sometimes the villain is actually the victim. The hero is the one who failed to help. And the real enemy is our own inability to recognize medical emergencies masquerading as moral crises. In the end, perhaps the most important question raised by the Venom theory isn't whether Scar deserved forgiveness, but whether the next Taka, the next person whose mind becomes compromised by factors beyond their control, will receive the help they need before it's too late. The answer to that question might determine whether future kingdoms rise or fall, whether families stay united or fracture, whether potential heroes become celebrated protectors or tragic cautionary tales. Because somewhere out there, another strange lion might be positioning another cobra, waiting for another opportunity to turn someone's medical crisis into everyone's catastrophe. The question is, will we be ready to recognize it this time? The Venom theory doesn't just rewrite Scar's story. It forces us to reckon with how we've been interpreting one of Disney's most beloved franchises through a fundamentally flawed lens. For decades, we've used The Lion King as a moral teaching tool, pointing to Scar as the embodiment of jealousy, ambition, and evil triumphant. We've taught children that some people simply choose darkness, that corruption comes from within, that victims and villains are easily distinguished by their actions and outcomes. But if the evidence suggests that Scar was actually a medical victim, whose brain was systematically destroyed by untreated neurotoxins, then we've been teaching the wrong lessons entirely. Instead of a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral corruption, Scar's story becomes a tragedy about society's failure to recognize and treat mental health crises before they spiral into catastrophe. This realization has profound implications for how we approach similar situations in our own world. When we encounter individuals whose behavior has become destructive or antisocial, our default assumption shouldn't be moral failing. It should be medical inquiry. What neurological, psychological, or chemical factors might be influencing their decision-making capacity? What treatment options exist? What systemic failures allowed their condition to progress without intervention? The strange lion's biological warfare strategy succeeded precisely because it exploited our tendency to interpret behavioral symptoms as character defects rather than medical emergencies. By using a slow-acting neurotoxin that gradually eroded Taka's judgment over years, The attacker ensured that each deteriorating decision would be seen as evidence of inherent corruption rather than progressive brain damage. This same blind spot exists in contemporary society. We criminalize addiction while underfunding treatment programs. We punish behavioral symptoms of mental illness while ignoring the underlying neurological conditions. We focus on containing dangerous individuals rather than understanding what made them dangerous in the first place. Consider how different the Lion King saga would have been if the Pride Lands had possessed better medical knowledge and social support systems. If Rafiki had immediately treated Taka's cobra bite with proper anti-venom protocols. If Mufasa had responded to his brother's concerning behavior with medical evaluation rather than social rejection. If the community had recognized neurological symptoms and mobilized resources for treatment rather than isolation. In that alternative timeline, Taka never becomes Scar. Mufasa lives to see his grandchildren grow up. The Pride Lands avoid years of devastation and famine. Countless lives are saved through early intervention, rather than late-stage damage control. The strange lion's biological warfare fails because his target receives proper medical care before permanent brain damage can occur. This isn't fantasy. It's an achievable outcome that was prevented only by institutional failures and cultural blind spots that we could address if we chose to prioritize prevention over punishment, treatment over containment, medical compassion over moral judgment. The parallels to real-world scenarios are impossible to ignore. How many mass violence incidents involve perpetrators with untreated mental health conditions? How many family tragedies unfold because someone's neurological symptoms were interpreted as personality flaws? How many preventable disasters occur because we lack systems for identifying and treating brain injuries, chemical imbalances, or degenerative conditions that affect behavior? The strange lion's strategy wasn't just effective against Taka. It would be effective against any society that prioritizes reactive justice over proactive healthcare, that treats mental health as a personal responsibility rather than a public health issue, that assumes behavioral problems indicate moral problems rather than medical problems. But recognizing this vulnerability also suggests solutions. We could develop better screening protocols for identifying neurological compromise before it reaches dangerous levels. We could train community leaders to recognize the early signs of brain injury or chemical imbalance. We could create support systems that respond to behavioral changes with medical intervention rather than social rejection. Most importantly, we could shift our cultural narrative from celebrating heroes who defeat villains to celebrating healers who prevent villainy from developing in the first place. The real heroes of any society are those who identify and treat problems before they become crises, who extend compassion to those whose minds have been compromised, who build systems that protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation by those who would weaponize their conditions. The Venom theory challenges us to become those kinds of heroes in our own communities. When we encounter someone whose behavior is becoming concerning, our first response should be inquiry, not judgment. What might be happening in their brain chemistry? What stressors or traumas might be affecting their decision-making? What resources exist to help them, and how can we ensure they receive proper care? This doesn't mean abandoning accountability or ignoring public safety. It means approaching destructive behavior with the same medical mindset we apply to other health emergencies. We don't blame cancer patients for their tumors or diabetes patients for their blood sugar levels. We shouldn't automatically blame individuals for behavioral symptoms that might result from neurological conditions beyond their conscious control. The Lion King has always been about the circle of life, the interconnectedness of all living things and the cycles that govern growth, decay, and renewal. But the Venom theory reveals a darker aspect of that circle. How untreated medical conditions can create cycles of trauma that spread far beyond the original victim. Taka's poisoning didn't just destroy his own life. It devastated an entire kingdom and traumatized multiple generations. Breaking these cycles requires recognizing that individual suffering can become collective catastrophe if left untreated. The strange lion understood this principle and weaponized it. We need to understand it too, but use that knowledge for healing rather than harm. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the Venom theory is that evil isn't always chosen. Sometimes it's inflicted through biological, chemical, or neurological means that compromise the victim's capacity for moral reasoning. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does suggest that our response to such behavior should emphasize treatment and prevention rather than punishment and condemnation. If Scar was indeed a victim of biological warfare rather than a willing villain, then his story becomes a cautionary tale about a different kind of danger. The risk of allowing medical emergencies to masquerade as moral crises until it's too late to intervene effectively. The next time we encounter someone whose behavior has become destructive, we might ask ourselves, are we looking at a Scar who chose darkness, or a Taka whose light was chemically extinguished by forces beyond his control? Are we witnessing moral failure or medical tragedy? Are we responding with the judgment that perpetuates cycles of harm, or the compassion that might finally break them? The answers to these questions could determine whether future tragedies unfold like the devastation of the Pride Lands, or whether they're prevented through early intervention and proper care. Whether potential victims become cautionary tales, or whether they receive the help they need to remain the heroes they were always meant to be. Because somewhere out there, another strange lion might be preparing another attack. Another cobra might be positioned for another strike. Another Taka might be walking unknowingly toward the moment that will determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who depends on him. The question isn't whether we can prevent all such attacks. It's whether we'll recognize them when they happen, respond with medical wisdom rather than moral judgment, and choose healing over punishment before it's too late. In the end, that might be the most important circle of all. The choice between perpetuating cycles of tragedy and breaking them through understanding, compassion, and proper care for those whose minds have been wounded by forces beyond their control. The real test of any society isn't how it treats its heroes. It's how it treats those who've lost their way, and whether it possesses the wisdom to help them find their way back before they take everyone else down with them. The Venom theory ultimately asks us to confront the most uncomfortable truth about human nature, that the line between hero and villain might be far thinner than we've ever dared to imagine. It forces us to acknowledge that sometimes the difference between a protector and a destroyer isn't moral choice, but medical circumstance. A single moment when biology overwhelms biography, when chemistry rewrites character, when a cobra's strike transforms a kingdom's greatest potential into its most devastating tragedy. What makes this revelation so unsettling isn't just its implications for how we understand Scar, but how it challenges our fundamental assumptions about accountability, justice, and the nature of evil itself. If someone's capacity for moral reasoning can be systematically destroyed by factors beyond their control, then perhaps our entire framework for judging human behavior needs radical reconstruction. The strange lion's biological warfare succeeded not just because of the cobra's venom, but because it exploited a universal blind spot in how societies process behavioral change. We're evolutionarily programmed to respond to threats with immediate defensive action, not careful medical analysis. When someone's behavior becomes dangerous, our survival instincts push us toward containment and elimination rather than diagnosis and treatment. This response made perfect sense when our ancestors faced immediate physical threats from predators or hostile tribes. But in complex modern societies, where the most dangerous individuals are often those suffering from treatable neurological conditions, our ancient defensive programming becomes counterproductive. We end up treating medical emergencies as moral crises, ensuring that problems escalate rather than resolve. The Pride Lands fell into this exact trap. Faced with Taka's deteriorating behavior, they responded with the social equivalent of fight or flight, rejection, isolation, and eventual banishment. These responses felt natural and justified at the time, but they accelerated rather than addressed the underlying medical crisis. Each rejection pushed Taka's damaged brain further into paranoid thinking. Each isolation deepened his psychological spiral. Each punishment confirmed his worst fears about being abandoned and betrayed. The tragic irony is that the Pride Lands possessed all the resources necessary to prevent this catastrophe. Rafiki's medical knowledge, Mufasa's political authority, the community's collective wisdom, all of these could have been mobilized to treat Taka's condition before it reached crisis levels. But institutional inertia and cultural blind spots prevented effective intervention until it was far too late. This pattern repeats itself across human history with depressing regularity. Individuals whose behavior becomes destructive due to medical conditions are marginalized rather than treated, criminalized rather than healed, demonized rather than understood. We create cycles of tragedy that could be broken through early intervention and proper care, then express shock when those tragedies ultimately unfold. The Venom theory suggests that breaking these cycles requires more than just better medical knowledge. It demands fundamental changes in how we conceptualize responsibility, punishment, and social response to behavioral problems. We need systems that can distinguish between chosen evil and inflicted compromise, between moral failure and medical emergency, between individuals who threaten society and those who are themselves threatened by conditions beyond their control. This doesn't mean abandoning accountability or ignoring public safety. It means developing more sophisticated approaches that can address root causes rather than just managing symptoms. It means creating support systems that respond to early warning signs with intervention rather than rejection. It means building communities that see behavioral problems as medical challenges requiring collective solution rather than moral failures deserving individual punishment. The Strange Lion's strategy worked because he understood something that the Pride Land's leadership apparently didn't. That destroying someone's mind is often more effective than destroying their body. Physical wounds heal and can be overcome through determination and support. But neurological damage attacks the very foundation of identity, decision-making, and moral reasoning. It turns the victim into an unwitting weapon against everything they once valued and protected. This type of biological warfare represents perhaps the most insidious threat any society can face. Unlike conventional attacks that can be defended against through military strength or political alliances, neurological warfare attacks the judgment and character of the defenders themselves. It turns protectors into threats, healers into harmers, heroes into villains, all while leaving the victims unaware that they're being manipulated. The only defense against such attacks is medical vigilance combined with social compassion. We need communities that can recognize neurological compromise in its early stages and respond with immediate intervention. We need healthcare systems that can identify and treat conditions before they progress to dangerous levels. We need cultural narratives that emphasize healing over punishment, prevention over reaction, understanding over judgment. Most importantly, we need the wisdom to see past surface appearances and behavioral symptoms to the underlying medical realities that might be driving destructive choices. The next Taka might not be obviously suffering from cobra venom. They might be dealing with traumatic brain injury, degenerative disease, chemical imbalance, or any number of conditions that can compromise moral reasoning and impulse control. If we're going to prevent future tragedies like the devastation of the Pride Lands, we need to become better at recognizing these conditions and responding with medical intervention rather than social rejection. We need to choose healing over punishment, treatment over containment, compassion over condemnation. The Venom theory ultimately isn't just about rewriting one character's story. It's about rewriting our understanding of how good people can become dangerous, how medical conditions can masquerade as moral failures, and how societies can either perpetuate or prevent cycles of tragedy through their response to behavioral crises. Scar's scar wasn't marking evil, it was marking victimization. His roar wasn't lost due to corruption. It was removed due to compromise. His reign wasn't the triumph of darkness. It was the logical conclusion of untreated neurological damage in a position of power. And perhaps most importantly, his story wasn't inevitable. It was preventable. If only someone had possessed the wisdom to see past symptoms to causes, past behavior to biology, past the villain to the victim who still needed help. The real question isn't whether Scar deserved forgiveness for his actions, but whether the next person whose mind becomes compromised by forces beyond their control will receive the medical attention they need before their condition destroys not just their own life, but the lives of everyone around them. Because in the end, we're all just one cobra bite away from losing everything that makes us who we are. The only thing standing between any of us and a similar fate is a society wise enough to recognize medical emergencies masquerading as moral crises, and compassionate enough to respond with healing rather than harm. That might be the most important lesson of all. That true strength lies not in defeating those who've been broken, but in preventing them from breaking in the first place. The circle of life continues, but whether it's a cycle of tragedy or healing depends entirely on the choices we make when confronted with those who've lost their way. Will we choose to be the Pride Lands that failed Taka, or the community that saves the next victim before they can become the next villain? The answer to that question might determine whether future stories end in triumph or tragedy, whether potential heroes fulfill their destiny or become cautionary tales, whether the strange lions of the world succeed in their biological warfare or finally meet societies wise enough to recognize and defeat their true weapon, our own inability to distinguish between symptoms and choices, between medical victims and moral villains, between those who need punishment and those who need help. The choice, as always, is ours.